The Behemoth Brewing Company presents the Department of Conversation with Pat Brittenden. Behemoth, give me something hoppy.
As we go live on what I think is a Wednesday afternoon, I get so caught up in times these days with legendary broadcaster Robbie Rakete. Morning, Robbie. Afternoon, Robbie, in fact. How you doing, man?
Hey, kia ora, Pat. I'm great, brother. Thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate this.
I'm really excited to talk to you for lots of reasons, but as I just said to you before we started, it's like, and I'll tell you specifically why in a minute, but I feel like I've circled you for 20-ish years. Now, I'm sure someone like yourself who's done, Countdown and RTR and has sort of been in our lives as consumers of what you've been doing for a long time sort of feel the way. But when I guess you work in the industry that I've come out of, that you're still in, you sort of know people who know people, and you're always sort of one step removed. And I was just saying to you, I feel like I've been circling you for 20 years, but it's the first time I think I've actually ever talked to you. So I'm really excited to talk to you and say g'day and see what Robbie's all about, the world of Robbie. And thanks for jumping in.
Yeah, man, because I know who you are, Tim. You're Pat Brittenden. So I'm like, I'm aware of who you are, what you've done, and it's like, gee, okay, I actually get a chance to sit down and talk with you. So I feel the same way, bro. So
thank you. I'll tell you where it all started for me. You have no idea of this, but this is to do with Mai FM. So I had what year did Mai FM start?
92, July 4th, 1992.
Wow, okay. That gives me a context. I remember sitting in a car when I was a kid with my dad, listening to ZB, ironically, and he was listening to, I can't remember who the host was. It shows the nature of my work ethic. I realized that this lady on the radio who was talking had a 3-hour shift. And I thought, oh, shit, that sounds like fun. 3 hours of work a day. Why don't we look at how to do radio? But I never really chased it, and I never really did it. And then there was this station. So I'm born in 73, so I'm 18 or 19 years old, right? And this new station starts up in Ponsonby or Grey Lynn in central Auckland. And is it Crummer Street? Yeah. Crummer Ave?
Yeah, there was Crummer Street, Crummer Ave, yeah.
Yeah, I remember. And I remember trying to figure out, what the hell is this station all about? Who are they? And because I had no knowledge of anything to do with the background of it, the idea about, how we're going to educate the audience, and I guess this is my interpretation, with the Maori language and that kind of stuff, I started searching for MY FM. Like, what is this? This is like the radio station talking about we're all going to own this or something. I didn't know what it was. And so I started searching for My FM, to try and figure it out. And obviously it never led to anything, and I never did anything in radio until sort of the late 90s. It wasn't something I actively chased, but there was an opportunity that presented itself which kind of got me in that door. But yeah, ever since then, it's like, since My FM became MAI FM, I feel like you've been in my circle. You know like radio is like. For people who don't know or who aren't so much into it, is you become one with the listener, sort of. They're your friends. They are whānau on some level. And you've been that for me since then, since the early 90s.
Oh, bro, well, that's a lovely thing for you to say. And you're right, with radio, you're in people's cars, you're in people's bedrooms when they're getting dressed, you're in the bathroom when they have a shower, when they go to the wharepaku, whatever. You are in their lives. I mean, it's more challenging now, of course, with podcasts and with streaming and stuff as well. But certainly there is still that element of people know you. They hear your voice every morning at a time when you're this thing in the background, or you're in the car when they're stuck in traffic. And I love that people come up to me and they say, you kick my day off with a smile, and you get me out the door, all those kinds of things. And look, man, it ain't brain surgery, as my old boss Ross Goodwin used to say. It's not brain surgery, Robert. You just want to try and make people have a good day, play some banging tunes. That's your job. And far out, how about that for a job? That I get to do this for a living. Far out, man. I still kick myself. I still feel very lucky.
It's when you say people get to know you. I remember when I was working at Maori FM, I was the mid-dawn guy, the very first job, and a friend of mine phoned me up and said, "Oh, did your car get broken into last night?" And I was like, I just worked at mid-dawn, so I was asleep, and I was like, "Oh, what's going on?" I just heard Brenton Lance talking about it. So your life kind of evolves around information that people know out there, based on what happens in the studio, but also that idea of in the car. I will never forget when I was working with Kim and Corbett, not as part of their team, but around them. They used to do this serial called Bob Bond. It was the funniest serial I have ever heard on the radio. It was so good. And I did something. I was filling in as the background person one morning, like they were on air and I was just doing some background stuff because someone was away. And Bob Bond got played at a different time by about 7 minutes. And I was in the office where Hillary was reading news, was getting set up for news. And someone phoned up basically in tears going, Bob Bond is supposed to play as I'm driving across the Harbour Bridge. How am I supposed to know if I'm late for work? It was actually it was their clock. Their clock was hearing Bob Bond. They knew they were on time if they were at the top of the Harbour Bridge. Yeah.
And you become such a part of people's lives. Like they set their day to you. So if they know that when they hit Whenua Road at this point, we're doing such and such on the show, then they're on time. And if we're late, it screws up their day. But it's also those things where people know you well enough that they will call up the show and be so vulnerable and share such personal things about their lives. We were talking yesterday about Possum Born. The topic was famous people who made your suburb famous, right? So for me, I grew up in Otara. So for me, Otara was Ryan and Betty Monga and Artie Shah, Eric Rush, Ruben Wiki, Tina Cross made Otara famous. And somebody rang up and said, Possum Born made Pukekohe famous. And then we get this text through from Spencer Born, his youngest, to the show. And so we rang him back and had a chat to him. He was 4 when his dad passed away. And there's a huge amount of responsibility that you have when people share their lives with you, especially a young fella, 22 years old, who listens to The Breeze and like, okay, it's great to talk about his dad, who as a motorsport fan myself, Possum Born, top of the list of people that you admire in motorsport. But not just Spencer. Over the years, there have been lots of people who have shared their stories with us, and that's a huge responsibility, and you feel very grateful that you're able to, that they trust you enough, to share that.
And that kind of same stadium as being vulnerable in that is also, I still look back on some of my best broadcasting moments as also some of the hardest. Like I was on air on Mai FM when the Twin Towers are crashed into.
Wow.
Because that happened at 1 a.m, and of course this was a music station, and I was a brand new sort of bottom of the totem pole sort of guy, but we spent the night sort of just talking about this thing going on, still playing music, and then Kim and Corbett came on, and I stayed on with Paul Ego, and we just produced the shit out of it together, and that show still ranks as, horrible. I've heard the guys from Simon Barnett talking about when Princess Diana died being one of the best broadcasting moments of his career, not for the horrible news, but for what it was. And then I was on air again at ZB when the first quake happened at Christchurch. Not the second one with all the tragic deaths, but the first one, because that was like 4 a.m. And I look back over when I was working in radio, these moments that are actually, maybe not to sound too wanky, but like when the nation's vulnerable, or when there's a empathetic ear needed, being the most amazing times in radio. Because the other thing is, people at that stage, and I think probably still tune in. They want to be somewhere where other people are. How can you get to a lot of people straight away? Turn on my favorite radio show.
Absolutely. And for an announcer, it's not about necessarily, at moments like that, it's not about you. It's for what do people need to hear, or what do they want to do? Do they want to call up and talk about what they're experiencing? And Christchurch was an example of that, where people were sharing their stories with radio stations around the country. And radio allows, because it's in their car, because it's in their homes, it's a medium that they feel comfortable with, and people take the time to call, so they can be powerful, and that's a privilege for you to be on air, during both of those experiences.
And the other one, of course, was the second quake in Christchurch. That happened obviously around lunchtime from memory, but then I was working at ZB at the time. That turned into sort of 5 straight days of just people talking and sharing their thoughts, and man, it was I've got some of the calls still in my hard drive somewhere, and some of those calls are still harrowing to this day about what people went through. Ooh.
Yeah, man.
Hey, well, it's just, look, speaking of radio, though, I want to say congratulations. Funnily enough, I had Clint on last week, Clint from The Edge. And now I've got you on, and you guys are the top 2 well, you're basically equal in number one music station in the country. Number one, most number of listeners to any station. You guys are right there neck and neck. And you guys at the Breeze, you guys at the Breeze are number one music breakfast in the country with the latest rating. So hugest congratulations, man. It's so exciting. It's so nice to see.
It's really kind of you to say. I also want to point out that the Breeze as a brand, as a radio station, is we have local breakfast shows throughout the country. So Jeanette Thomas and I, we're in Auckland, and you've got Steve Joel here with Kath Beer in Wellington, Christchurch. Obviously you have Hillary and Fitzy. So we have all these and many others as well. So forgive all those other shows. Forgive me for not mentioning everybody, but that's a combination of all that hard work of everybody.
And so, Damien's here in Dunedin, who's an amazing guy. I've had him on the podcast a couple of times. So you're broadcasting out of Auckland. How many regions do you go into?
We just do Auckland, bro.
So you're Auckland. So you're basically a local breakfast show. That's so exciting.
Well, it is, and it was a call that we made a little while ago because we were doing Auckland. We kind of covered off some of the regions, and I felt like there was an opportunity for us to just be an Auckland specific breakfast show. Not just me, but others as well. At the time when we made the call to just do Auckland, and it reminded me of my time at Mai FM because Mai FM was just an Auckland breakfast show. And it means we can just concentrate on, the largest city in the country. But I think that's one thing it's still good to have a local breakfast show in Tamaki,
I think the way, and I'm actually talking to someone about this for another project at the moment, for those of us out there like myself who are kind of working outside the world of like mainstream organized broadcasting, in New Zealand, it hasn't quite had the same impact as it has, say, in America, and what's happening in America with things like podcasting and independent groups, independent news and that kind of thing. But I think the way that radio survives in any way and moves forward even is to go back to what we maybe saw in the 80s before networking of hyper-local. So I think the idea of having a Auckland, breakfast show for Auckland, I think it's an amazing idea. And I think it's probably one of the reasons you guys are seeing the success. I mean, obviously there's the talent, but that idea to be able to talk about, the SPQR in Ponsonby rather than having to say, I went to a cafe, to actually be quite specific about it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. But it's also not only can you talk about traffic in Auckland, which is always a nightmare, and those kinds of things that Aucklanders want to know when they wake up. What's the weather like? What's the traffic like? But you can celebrate whatever region you're in, celebrate those local stories. You can get out amongst the community, and it's community radio, but in Auckland, it's on a bigger scale, and we love that, mate. We love it. And I'm an Aucklander. I was born and bred, grew up in South Auckland, live in the city. So, bro, this is my town. I love it.
I saw it's no longer part of MediaWorks. It's now Discovery, isn't it? But I saw TV3 was considering shutting down the Dunedin office, and Dave Gooselink, who's the journalist down here, was going to be. And then what happened 2 days ago? We've had this horrible and horrific stabbing in one of our supermarkets down here. And, no one ever wants to see that kind of thing happen. But I did think when it did happen, I hope Discovery reconsider now, because obviously Dave's all over it. I noticed TVNZ News had a reporter reporting about the Dunedin story out of Christchurch, but then Dave was standing in front of the countdown reporting out of Dunedin. And I hope that this horrible thing that's happened, which shouldn't have happened and no one wants to see happen, but if nothing else, it gets some of those media organisations to realise, actually, even for 2 or 3 or 4 stories a year of this importance, you need to have someone with legs on the ground.
Yeah, can I drop a name here?
Yeah.
Years ago, I grew up listening to Rick Dees and the American Top 40. He's like one of my idols, one of my heroes, along with Paul Holmes, Merv Smith, these people I grew up listening to. We go to Kiss FM in LA, and we go. I just wanted to meet him, just get an autograph and just shake the man's hand. So we're there, and this producer comes out and he's chatting to us, myself and Manu Taylor and Nick Brown. The 3 of us go to LA to do radio stuff and some stuff for MTV. And you realize later what the producer's doing is just sizing you up. Like, is this kid good talent? He says, come in and meet Rick. And we go into a studio, and I can hear Rick D's voice, and then suddenly there he is sitting behind his microphones, and he's got a wall of carts behind him. And he's got pots on his desk, not faders, because that's what he grew up doing. State-of-the-art desk, but rewired for his pots.
Wow.
And the producer sits me down, so I sit down, points at the headphones. So I put the headphones on, and I'm staring at Rick D's. And then he turns my mic on. He says, all the way from New Zealand, we're Robert. But what I got from that show leading up to it and afterwards was he was hyper local about LA. He made LA sound like your local town. It was what's happening on the 405, what the weather's doing. He had people calling up all over LA and name and suburb every single time. Where are you calling from? And celebrating these different things around Los Angeles. And it was so local. And then after I'd done my time with him on air, they asked me to stick around and I could, catch up with them after the show. Went into this whole separate wing at Kiss FM that was just for Rick D's, which is now, obviously Ryan Seacrest does breakfast there now, has done for a while. And I got to sit down with the man and have like a masterclass on radio. And he talked about local radio and how important what helped them in LA was being the fact that they celebrate what it means to live in this amazing city, every single morning. That was like a lesson that I took away. So yeah, I love local radio.
Yeah, and I guess the difficulty with New Zealand is our population size makes it difficult. But then I remember Nathan Darade and John Bridges when they were on Channel Z doing the breakfast show there. They had a really lovely way about them of making us sound local no matter where you were. So much like, name and suburb, they'd answer the phone and they'd talk about, from the 03 or from the 04, from the 07. In other words, locating the area code so you could see, at least it would be South Island, in the 04, what's happening in the 04. And they very cleverly, I mean, obviously it was planned, but very cleverly, they made the whole country sound like, a local postcode, even though they might have been in Auckland and they were talking to someone in Invercargill, they were the 03. It was cool.
That's great. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually, because I was thinking about your interaction with the Wiggles. And when I have this thought, I think about an experience in my head about people that I've been lucky enough to interact with because of what I've been doing. And you've just mentioned Rick Dees as one of them, which prompts me to think that. And the one that I always fall back on for me is John Clark. I was lucky enough I never met the man, unfortunately, but I was actually doing a radio play. And he played a character. So I got to spend 40 minutes kind of on the phone with John Clark, recording the thing. But then also talking in between about stuff. And even though, he's so iconic in my, in my world that even though I didn't even see his face, I got to spend 40 minutes on the phone with John Clark, which is like, that's up there for me. You've met the Dalai Lama, but what are some of those things or people or experiences that you think of that go, I've been so lucky to experience X, like being invited to the Wiggles because of what I'm doing?
I'm sure we'll get onto the Wiggles later, but just in terms of radio, I once went to the New Zealand Music Awards and they'd have tables with people's names on it, and I swapped my name tag so I could sit next to Merv Smith. And people don't know Merv Smith; he was the #1 breakfast radio host on 1ZB back in the day, and that's who I grew up listening to, just so I could sit next to him. And then, poor guy, I peppered him with questions about radio. But bless him, he was so kind and patient with his time, and he just gave me advice that I still use today.
Wow.
Paul Holmes is the same. Paul actually rang up. I've been on Mai FM, like Paul #1 breakfast show in Auckland, me on Mai FM breakfast 0, bottom of the table. The phone rings in the studio. I answer the phone. This voice goes, "Yeah, hello, yes, it's Paul Holmes here." I go, "Yeah, cool," and I just hang up. Right. Boss comes down and goes, "Did you just hang up on Paul Holmes?" I said, "No, I hung up on a guy who said it was Paul Holmes." He goes, "No, you just hung up on Paul. He's going to call back again, answer the phone." I was like, "Oh, shit." So the phone rings. "Yes, it's Robert." Yes, it's Paul Holmes here. You hung up on me, you bastard." I said, "I'm sorry, Paul. Why would you call me?" So he'd been on holiday and he'd been listening to the breakfast show. And he goes, "Listen, I've got some notes for your show." "Robert, got some notes for your show. Have you got a pen and paper handy?" I go, "Yes." So I'm scrambling. And he's on the phone. He's like, "Right." He goes, I want you to take your birthday calls, put them at 10 to 8 to do this here. I want you to do this here and do this here. And I want you, don't drop, that bit's terrible. You don't want that bit there. Don't bother talking to that person. They slow you down. You know when to get out. And it's just like this. I'm writing furiously as Paul said all this stuff, right? And I thanked him. And then 4 years later, 3 or 4 years later, I have my first #1 book in Auckland, radio ratings book in Auckland. And a letter arrives on ZB letterhead from Paul, handwritten, saying, "I'm so proud of you." and what you've achieved. Congratulations. This is the start of a beautiful career. Lovely.
Wow.
Really lovely. Signed Paul Holmes. The
And
next day in the Herald, sorry, bro, just finish it.
Yeah.
The next day in the Herald is they asked Paul about me, rating. And because he was still number one breakfast host. I was number one music host, so I was number two, technically number two behind him. And he goes, there's daylight between me and the kid. So the public Paul, he's like a boxer in the ring, man. But the guy off air helped me get to that place and never, ever spoke about it, which is why I do. I said to him, how can I thank you? And he said, pay it forward. If you find a broadcaster you think has got something, have a chat to them. If you can help them out anyway, do that. So, yeah.
So tell me, I'm pretty sure, because I was working in and around the ZB marketplace and for then Radio Works, I think, at some stage, it might have only been for one book, didn't you guys topple ZB number one in Auckland?
Only time any radio station has ever beaten ZB to be the number one radio station in Auckland. Yeah, happened once. And they were kind enough to send us flowers. I've caught up with Bill Francis once. Bill was in charge of ZB. And when we caught up, I think he'd retired from ZB. But I really appreciated his time because he's written a couple of books, about radio. And I went over to his place and we sat down and we just talked about radio. Because I'm a bit of a geek about it, like the structure of radio, I really dig. How do you make it better? So talking to Merv Smith and Paul Holmes and Bill Francis and Rick Dees, is all stuff that I just put in my kitty, to hopefully help me be a better broadcaster. So that was a class move from ZB to send those flowers over.
Do you reckon radio? I've got lots of things to come back to do with Paul Holmes because I had lots of chances to interact with him when I was the butt boy at ZB working mid-dawns. Let me do it now then. The thing about Paul Holmes was he was so genuinely interested in people and genuinely caring. Some of the stories of like the boys from ZM turning up to Holmesy's house in I think it was in Remuera, and him just bringing them aside and them all having a drinking session together. Now, some will comment about Holmesy's drinking. That's another conversation to be had for another day. But he would just welcome them in, open up the top shelf, and they'd be doing it. And for me, because I was doing the overnights, I would be leaving. He'd already be there, but he'd always come down for a cigarette, like at 2 minutes to 6. So we'd often be taking that ride together, that ride down. Yeah. And he would say to me, I've told this story before. I told it to someone else who works at ZB on this show. He said to me, "So what are they talking about?" And I'd be like, "Oh, nice small talk." And I realized after a while he actually was looking for a feel of what the punters were and wanted to talk about. So it's a crazy way to think about it now today for me, but he was actually almost treating me like an equal, which I wasn't. I was a junior and he was a senior. But in that moment, he was saying to me, can you give me something that will help me understand the New Zealand audience today?
And, that's why the man was number one on television, number one on radio. He worked his ass off. He was, his awareness and his capacity. Can I tell you, I once went to this television presenters, it was like for young presenters. I think TVNZ were doing it. It was like a course. And there were a few of us speaking to these young presenters who are about to break into telly. And Paul did this brilliant thing. He gets up and he looked around every single one. He goes, I've had the chance to see your work since you've started, like this year. Brilliant. You're all brilliant. You all have an amazing future in radio and television. I can see big things for all of you. And they all nodded and looked at each other like, wow, Paul Holmes said this about us. And then he goes, so how many of you believe me? And there was this silence. He goes, because I don't really know who any of you are. But my point is this, you're going to get that a lot. People are going to just say that you are the next big thing. But you don't become the next big thing by just people telling you it. You have to do the work. If you don't do the work, you're not going to have a career. And I was sitting there going, masterclass. That's a masterclass. That's all you need to know. But he did it in a gentle way. He wasn't making fun of them, but he's just like, you need to be aware that this is what this world, and it's only a small world, the New Zealand that we live in, this broadcasting world, is what it's like. So be prepared to work hard.
Do you think that, to me, when I hear those kinds of stories, and I remember, I'm a couple of years younger than you, only a couple though. So I remember the 1080 Club on Sunday mornings on ZB. You were probably at the end of secondary school when I was at the start of secondary school, sort of thing. I don't quite remember Merv as much. I do remember the school bell in the mornings and that, but it's a bit blurry. I sort of remember from when it became ZB, which I think, like News Talk, which was, I think was about 87 or so. But I hear what you're saying, and one of the things, the words that come to mind is things like the gracious nature that broadcasters, these special broadcasters used to have. And the genuine, the rising tides thing, or the rising tide lifts all boats. If we can make broadcasting better across New Zealand, it's better for everyone, sort of thing.
Sure.
As someone now who's in one of those positions of seniority, success, profile when it comes to radio, do you think that's still the culture of radio today, even up to and including? I remember Brent Harbour telling me stories, who's a now works for, I think, Maori FM up in north of Auckland, but a fantastic broadcaster, about how they used to rate each other's promos from different radio stations, and it was sort of done for fun, and then at one point management stopped it because it got a bit over the top. And so I'm wondering, radio today versus that gracious rising, all boats rising, sending flowers to the opposition when they success. Is that still something that's today, or is that gone?
I think it is back. You're right. There was a time when, people would do crazy, wacky radio. There was a host on ZM who'd call the Mai FM breakfast show and just run a tape over it and just try and I don't know, get us being annoyed, getting grumpy, whatever, it being just prank caller. But the rule was always, whenever anyone rang the station, you always treated them with respect. It wasn't something that you faked. So whether you are genuinely just calling up because you want to have fun with us, or because you're from another competing radio station, you're trying to play a gotcha with us, they never got anywhere. And that host apologized to me a few years later for saying, "Oh man, I was such addicted to that stuff that I can't do it." I was like, "Bro, it's okay. It's just radio." But is it happening now? I think there is a culture. There is a shift in radio in the way that we are with each other within a company, and how we interact with people outside that company. And you would have seen stuff on Instagram. Those are really important conversations for us to have. There is now more of a focus on how we treat each other. There's stuff that happened when I started in radio that now would get you fired, and rightfully so. It was of a time, but guess what, man? Those times have changed. We have evolved as broadcasters. We've had to. I have always found personally the people that I've met in radio who I respect, who have had longevity in their careers, people in music or in entertainment or broadcasting who've had longevity, have been essentially good people. And that's why I believe they've been able to have such a long career. They've treated people with respect. There've been times maybe you've been firm with people, but ultimately you treat people how you want to be treated. What's the thing that Rock says? It's nice to be important, but it's important to be nice. And I think that actually talent and all that stuff, yes, absolutely, hard work for sure. But how you treat people remember that stuff. And I think that's something that radio is now looking at closely. And
eventually it comes out. I guess the example that comes to mind, not to do with New Zealand, but is Alan. Alan was talked about as, seen by the public as the nicest person in the world. Apparently she's a bit of a hard ass behind the scenes. Now, whether that's right or wrong, good or bad, whatever, but eventually authenticity comes out. And that's what I love. One of the things I love about doing this, what we're doing right now, is people often get a chance to talk about stuff they don't normally talk about, because it's not a 7-minute interview between 2 ad breaks or between 3 songs or whatever. Yeah. And sometimes you see a different side of someone. It's not something I aim for. I just aim to have interesting chats with people. But you sometimes get an authentic sense of who someone is, and you're like, oh man, Di Henwood, you're really politically astute, and there's a lot about you that doesn't come across with your brilliant but slightly ridiculous jokes on 7 Days. That kind of thing. It's that authenticness eventually comes out if you're authentically nice. What Paul Holmes did for you didn't come out from him, didn't come out from his colleagues. It's coming out from you. Eventually, the authenticness comes out. Yes. And if you're authentically a prick, then eventually that will come out.
Absolutely. People don't want to work with you. You know, it's as simple as that. And I don't think you can get a good team around you, whatever it is, whether it's radio, broadcasting, whatever, whether you run a corner dairy, whatever it is you do, you want to create a space where people feel like they are valued, they are welcomed, their ideas are welcomed, you know, and especially in this business, because in radio, ideas is your currency.
Mm-hmm.
That's how shows turn up every day and do something. You can't just phone it in. You got to have ideas constantly going. You've got to be working ahead all the time. And you want to create an atmosphere where people feel like they can chuck an idea in. I don't care whether you've been around as long as I have, or whether you're a broadcasting student. If you've got an idea, Paul Holmes talking to you in the lift on the way down. He could completely ignore you. He's freaking Paul Holmes. But he realizes that you have something that could come in handy for him every day. And that is, what's the mood? How are the people this morning? You know, and good broadcasters realize that they have to be open to all these ideas. And and that's what you asked me before. Hopefully I do that, and I've done that over the years.
I always have heard from friends who are teachers, there's two types of senior teachers. So a senior teacher is someone who's been there long enough that they have seniority and management experience. Sure. My friends who were teachers of the era, this is 20 years ago, would say there's two kinds of senior teachers. There's the ones who say, you're a beginning teacher, you know nothing, stay out of my way and start learning. And there's the senior teachers that go, you're a beginning teacher, you've just come out of university, you might have some new practices and processes that I can learn from. And those senior teachers are the ones that I'm told are the ones that go on to be the best principals and whatever else they need to be. I
don't know everything about radio. I don't. I know a lot, but I don't know everything. And I'm still learning now. And I think that when you stop learning, then you don't evolve. And people like Robert Scott, who is a good friend of mine, who's been in radio for 30 plus years, you know, he's evolved as a broadcaster. That's why he is the number one drive time host in the entire country. He's been around for years. He evolves. He works really hard as well. And he's very talented. That's a given. And he's one of my best mates. So I can say this about the guy. But I know how hard he works. And he's not doing the same stuff he was doing all those years ago. So you have to be open to new ideas. You have to be open to feedback. The one I love is that, you know, Roger Federer, when he was the number one tennis player in the world, still had a coach.
Mm.
You know, I still want to get feedback from people. I may not like it sometimes. I may push back a little bit on some of the things that people are pulling me up on the show, but I think it's important to be open to what other people have to say, and vice versa.
You're talking about there's things that we used to do, you know, 20 years ago, whatever the time frame was, that we get fired for doing today.
Sure.
I had Kim Vanell on the podcast the other day, you know, Kiwi journalist and anchor who's now working for Al Jazeera. Ironically, this never came up in the podcast. I had a look, and the Al Jazeera network she works for, you know, I know only 40 million viewers.
Yeah.
The numbers are just unfathomable to us little Kiwis who have, you know, 650,000 listeners at our big radio station. This is 40 million viewers. And we were talking a bit about this Instagram account, Beneath the Glass Ceiling, which is I think the one you were referencing about what's happening in Aotearoa's music industry and radio, based around some stuff that have come out of MediaWorks. No, actually, I should read. I don't know that's the case. Not that it's based out of, but seems to be lining up with some of the stories that have come out of some of the instances for maybe one person at MediaWorks. I don't know. I don't know too much about it, so I won't get into that. But the thing I said to her, and I think you're a good example of this, is also the speed at which things are changing. I mean, 2014, is that when you got invited to be part of the Wiggles?
Yeah.
So that's 7 years ago as the Brown Wiggle. Now, no problems with that idea. Didn't think about it in 2014. Thought, how fucking lucky is Robbie to be a part of the Wiggles? In fact, let's for people who, I'm sure people have seen it, but let's have a little look-see at what you were all about as the Brown Wiggle. And obviously, there we go. We have a little bit of music as well. You know, it's one of those moments that how exciting is that you get a chance to be part of this iconic group that's been around already for 30 years and probably will be around for another 30 in its various forms. But when I had Anthony Bluewiggle on, for those who don't know about it, on a couple of weeks ago, I thought in this current climate, 7 years later, the Brown Wiggle has very different connotations, especially when it comes to also our Maori representation within the Wiggles. So in that shorter time frame, it feels like it's gone from a quirky joke to inappropriate. So it's moving very fast. But how did you approach that? Because you did some touring with them just now as well, didn't you?
Yeah, that was a really interesting. So you go back to 8 years ago to 2014, and it was just a radio thing that I would do one show with the Wiggles in Auckland. And my first thing was I don't want to screw it up and I don't want to embarrass them. So I just, leading up to that one show that I did, I immersed myself in everything Wiggly, man. I watched so many videos. I read Anthony's book. I just wanted to get a real understanding of what the Wiggles are about so that when I went up on stage, I wouldn't embarrass myself or them. And the brown wiggle thing was the joke at the time.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is the gag, it's brown wiggle. I got a brown skivvy. Someone made a brown skivvy for me. So that was 2014. Even then, the Wiggles said to me, when I went over there to do that video that you're watching now,
yeah,
they said, how do you feel about the brown thing? Because we're happy for you to change it, because the visuals of 4 white Australians, they've never called me the brown wiggle. It was always the Kiwi wiggle, honorary wiggle, our mate Robbie.
Yeah.
I said, I get that. I appreciate where you're coming from. I'm comfortable with it. So I only ever did the odd show every now and then. But this year they asked me to do the whole tour. And I was like, you know what? That's like telling the same joke for the last 8 years. It's time to change it up. And so I said, look, I want to change the skivvy. I got hold of them. So I want to change the skivvy. And they said, great. What do you want to do? Went back to my old primary school in East Tamaki in South Auckland. Some kids did some beautiful drawings for me. We ultimately turned that into the new skivvy. So for me, I was wearing something that represented where I came from, that I was proud to wear. And that told a story of where I was from and where I am now and my time with the Wiggles. So I was really excited about that. Then a story went up online saying that there was criticism and that was the reason why I was made to change it. And that's not it at all. I wasn't made to change it. I wanted to change it. I'm aware that times have changed, but I also wanted to do something that was special that I could wear on this tour that spoke to who I am and where I come from. So every time we did a show, we did 25 shows in 2 weeks, 14 days.
Oh, cool.
I always had the opportunity to talk about that skivvy and where it came from. And that's the story for me. I get that there's the whole cancel culture thing that's, people want to write up about, but that was never it. I got phone calls from radio stations saying, do you want to explain what's happening? Yeah, bro. I just changed my mind.
But even that, it's not a part of, there was no pressure there. Someone like me thinks, gosh, should that character be called the Brown Wiggle today? So even though it wasn't a pressure type thing, the conversation has still changed enough for people to think, is that what 2021, how we're going to represent it? Yeah,
for sure. And you know what? That didn't stop people from calling me the Brown Wiggle, and I never was offended by that at all. Like, hey, it's Brown Wiggle. Yeah, it's a new skivvy, but I hear where you're coming from. I get it, that's fine. But again, it was never something that the Wiggles as a group and as fellow performers ever said, well, you've got to be the Brown Wiggle because that's the colour of your skivvy. It was always like, he's from New Zealand, he's our mate. And that was always where they had me. But this was a thing for me to change. And you're right, there was an opportunity for us to do something different this time. And I was really excited to do it. I was happy to change it. And the great thing was, the Wiggles saw the skivvy and they said, we've got to get these kids up on stage. So here we are at Spark Arena with these kids from Mayfield Primary School, my old primary school, and they all come up on stage in front of these thousands of people because we wanted to celebrate what they'd done. Them and all their families got tickets to the show. Then the next day, the Wiggles, we all went back to my primary school. And we only went to one school in the whole tour. And I was driving them out there, and we drove past my old house where I grew up. I did the tiki tour of East Tamaki and Otara, and they were really interested. And then we got to the Porphyry with the kids. They were genuinely touched by it. So for Mayfield Primary and for the Wiggles, there was this wonderful experience that we all got something out of it. And that's the story of the skivvy for me.
And that's a cool story. It's almost like, I've said this, not that you can tell at the moment because I've got someone who likes to dye my hair, so it's not my natural colour at the moment. But I always joke about that. I'm so sort of, the literal Irish roots are coming out of my pores. So I've always claimed that I like to understand and like to be a part of the authentic New Zealand story within Māoridom, but it's not a part of my bloodline.
Sure.
But what I hear you describing sounds quite Maori. It sounds quite, this is my roots, this is my mountain, this is my primary school, this is where I'm from. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And the Wiggles were, when I wrote Kia Pai Tō Rā, so Anthony goes, do you want to write a song about New Zealand? And I was like, okay. So we'll take the guitar back to the hotel. I was over in Sydney and see what you come up with. So I go to the hotel and I'm bang out a song, like, I'll try this, and then the next time we go back and all the Wiggles gather around, and I'm like, I'm playing a children's song to the Wiggles. I'm a DJ. What am I doing here? What if it sucks? And they loved it. And they're like, so what does Kia Pai Tōra mean? What is a tiki tour? What is a whare? What is a hangi? Genuinely interested in it. Then when we reshot the video again, last year, a couple of years ago, we got a kapahaka group from Sydney to come and join us. And when they walked in full kapahaka with moko and Korowai and Kaka, who they looked over at the Wiggles, they were freaked out because they were the Wiggles. And the Wiggles were like, oh my gosh, you look amazing. Tell us about this. Like, they're actually genuinely interested. It wasn't like we're just going to exploit this experience because it makes us look like we care. They actually genuinely care and are curious. And that's what you want. Yeah.
And I think what I'll do is when people are listening to this podcast, because you can listen or watch, in the Facebook and the YouTube versions of it, I'll put a link to Anthony's podcast as well, because he tells stories about that. He tells stories within that of like traveling through Northern Australia and seeing some, Indigenous activities that weren't there for tourists, and them just wanting to learn. And funny, you talk about they want to know what the words were. When he was talking to me, he was like, I still don't know what a tiki tour is. So I said to him, I'd interpret for him what some of those words were. And if he needed any help while they were here, he had my number and he could just give me a call to explain them to him. But yeah, he did, him in particular, he's obviously the only Wiggle I've ever spoken to, did seem particularly like someone who wanted to know what I love about talking to people is I like to know why people believe what they believe. Even if I disagree with it, if I can see how you've got to your conclusion, I like to understand it. It seems that he liked to know why people, what their beliefs were, or what put them in that position, or who made them who they are and why. He wanted to go, like we talk about level 1 conversations, he wanted to go to at least level 3, potentially level 5 to find out more.
Yeah, they're curious.
Yeah.
And I think that's all you want, they're respectful and they're curious. They want to know how the language is, what the greetings mean, how do I say hi to one person, 2 people, a group. They want to understand all that. I wrote another song, the A to Z of New Zealand, the New Zealand alphabet song. We had words like upoko means head, and we threw a lot of Maori words in there as well. And, they love that. They're genuinely about celebrating. They go, you give us an insight into what New Zealand is about. I don't hold myself up, by the way, as the touchstone of everything Aotearoa, but I'm able to give them an idea of what my experience is of Aotearoa. So, and they welcome that, and you played that video before, Kia Pai Tōra. It's had over 15 million views. Now, if I just put that out on my own, it would have 5 views, and they'd all be me. But it's the Wiggles, and it's the power of the Wiggles that people actually engage. I've had letters from people from Croatia, or emails from Croatia, the UK, through Middle East, Dubai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, from New Zealanders who live overseas who go, I play that song to my kid every morning because it reminds me of home.
Oh, nice.
And you just go, well, kia ora to that, that's really lovely, that little ditty that I wrote, in a panic, is able to remind people of home in some small way.
You sound like a proper rock star. You hear like people like Adele or Ed Sheeran or whoever it was, David Grohl saying, I had to find a chorus and I wrote that in 3 minutes in my thing. And then it turned into learning to fly or something.
But it's amazing. We had a young woman in Wellington who Anthony said to her, we met them backstage, and it was like a Make-A-Wish thing, and Anthony said, what Wiggle song would you like to sing? And she said, I like to sing Kia Pai Tōra. And it hit me, this I got quite emotional about it, because this young woman was singing it to me and the Wiggles, and Anthony was on the guitar. We're all singing it with her, and she got stuck on a couple of lines, and I just give her the line and she kept going, and you could just see her like, I'm singing this song, I'm going to do my best to make sure I do a great job of it. And when I finished, I was quite overwhelmed. And I went back downstairs and we were talking, and I said to Emma, I was like, I've never had that happen to me before. It must be what it's like to be you guys all the time. Mm-hmm. People want to show you what you've done for them, to have that song sung back to me. It's just like, bro, I can retire now. I never have to do another tour. I've just experienced the most beautiful thing. So, yeah.
But that must have happened to you in broadcasting. I mean, when someone comes back to you and says, like, I'll give you an example, not to toot my own horn, but to say it. I remember there was a moment, because I overnights on ZB. So midnight to 6 a.m. for people who don't understand what that means.
It's a special time of the day, isn't it?
And you get special people listening on all levels. I remember a call from a person, and that was the father of and the daughter was an adult daughter who had cancer and was dying. And he told a story on the radio, and what the hell do you do with that? Other than kind of go, okay, and just kind of let them talk sort of thing. He identified himself as a person of faith, Christian faith, more specifically. And we talked, and that was it. And later in the show, I can't remember whether it was at the end of that hour or the end of the following hour or whatever. It's a long shift, 6 hours of talk back. I said, if such and such, I don't even remember his name to my embarrassment. If such and such is still listening,
yeah,
I'm gonna take a break now. So I'm gonna play a song to go into the news. It's for you. Go around your house now. Put all the radios on. It was like 4 a.m. or something. Turn all the radio speakers up, and I'm playing it for you. And it was, I think it was the Millennium Prayer by Cliff Richard. Is that right?
Yeah,
Cliff Richard.
no, that's right.
Which, for people who don't know, is a prayer. Like from that, and I knew it because I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I played it. Didn't think any more about it. And he phoned me, I don't know, within 6 months. His daughter had died, and he explained to me how important that moment was for them.
Yeah.
And I was like, again, like, okay, I'll just sit back and you can just talk. I'm not telling the story to try and say yay me, but you must have had those moments on broadcasting as well, where people have come back to you and said, this was so important when you did this at this time for these reasons.
Yeah, for sure. And that's that privilege that we have as broadcasters, whether you're on TV or radio or podcasting or whatever you're doing, that you are able to welcome people into your world, but also you're a part of their world, and they share their stories with you, and that's a huge privilege. And I many years ago, I became friends with a young guy at Starship, and sadly he passed away, but we spent a lot of time together with him and his family. He's a lovely kid. And he was only like about 12, I think, when he passed away, but there was a wisdom that overcomes a person when they realize their mortality and that they aren't too far now. And had a hugely profound effect on me. I couldn't go back to Starship for many years after that because it was just too painful. Wow. I remember one time I got really upset because he'd taken a turn, and the nurse just called me out of the room before I started to cry, and I went around the corner. She said, "Don't you dare cry in front of him." Mm-hmm. And I said, "No, I won't cry." She goes, because she sees it all the time, that when people go to Starship and they get upset for the kids feel like they need to make you feel better. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, that's the irony, isn't it? Like, oh, here I am, I've got cancer, but let me see if I can make you feel better about your life. So I was really clear on that. Went back in, and we had a great time. And then I was always just trying to find the smiles in his day. One time he'd had some treatment that made him quite sick, and I didn't realize he'd had a raspberry soft drink. And so I walk in, he'd already finished it. He put his mask on, and then he started to throw up, but it looked like blood.
Oh no.
And I'm freaking out. I'm on the buzzer going, come on, this is not good. And he starts laughing in between, the convulsions of and I'm going, I don't know how you can be so happy about this. And he's going, bro, it's raspberry, and we laughed, man. Like, we laughed until we cried. The nurses laughed when they came in and they saw my face. He was like, oh, I'll never forget that. It was a privilege for me from just being on the radio. I met this amazing young man and his family, and I will always have that with me, always. And I'm always grateful for the life that I have when I think about what he went through. So you're right, it is a privilege that we have, and to listen to that man tell his story for you is, sometimes people just want people to listen to them.
I also find as well sometimes with what maybe not what I do now, but what I've done, and maybe what you're still doing, is you can open doors for people as well, whether it's intentional or not. It was funny, we've talked about the earthquake today, and it was the second earthquake after Christchurch, and I needed a break. I was doing 6 hours of talkback, which was all kind of like I was in the building and it fell on top of me, and so it was pretty heavy stuff. And a friend of mine, Jeanette Rakete, musical artist who's done a national anthem, a new version of the national anthem, same words, different rhythm. And I played it in the middle of the night, and I was like, I just needed a break, basically. I played it in the middle of the night. I think I cried in the studio as I was playing it as well, because it was just that sort of a night. And again, I got one of those, I don't know if I'm a bit of a weirdo, but I got one of those senses. It's just like, I just had this feeling coming out of the 5 o'clock in the morning news, and I went, and I started the last kind of half hour before the news starts at 5:30, and I was like, look, I played this earlier tonight, and you don't normally do this. You don't normally do something twice in a night, and it's not good radio, but I was being selfish. I was playing it for me. I needed a break. And I just get this sense that I need to play it for you now. And take it as you will, but here it is, and I played it again. Unbeknownst to me, the breakfast team from the Hits in Wellington, Polly and Grant from ZM at the time, there was all these breakfast radio teams driving into their radio stations at that exact time, going, how the fuck are we going to talk about the earthquake today? Heard it, and then they all played it, and then the stories that came from when they played it filtered back to us and filtered back to Cindy. She had 10,000 downloads that day of that song, sort of thing. But people telling Polly and Grant, I heard it when I was walking through the mall, and the whole mall stood still and listened. So
you're allowed to be vulnerable. I mean, we ask our listeners sometimes to be vulnerable. You know what? You're allowed to as well. Yeah. Because you're only human too. And when people hear you share parts of your life, because sometimes we all know social media can be the highlights reel of your life. Radio can be there too. But we're not all like that. When my mum passed away, that was awful. Yeah. It was awful. It sucked. It still sucks, over 3 years later. And to talk about that honestly on air, it was difficult. But sometimes, you know what, you go on air, you leave stuff at the door, but there are times when you're really vulnerable and you don't feel great, and you can say to your listeners, because they trust you, you can say, today's not a good day, and this is why, because I really miss my mum, and the phone calls come through both for myself and Jeanette. We both lost our mums in the same year. And I'll be out, people go, thank you for saying how I feel, so you're allowed to, you're only human, you're allowed to speak your truth as well. Yeah. I like, and I know I kind of had a bit of a joke about it before about that. I'm a bit weird because I get these feelings, but I like kind of going, this feels right. I'm going to do this now. Like, this is not good standard. This is not good, quote unquote, good radio. My boss is going to say, why'd you do that twice in a night? But, it just feels right. So you do it. And it doesn't hit all the time, often. I mean, who knows? But when I say hit, I don't mean seeking for success. I mean, making it a positive impact, something positive coming from it. But when it does, they're the best moments in the world, man. Yeah, absolutely. Best job in the world, bro. Yeah. Best job. Yeah, people say to me sometimes, would you get back into it? And I'm not saying that there's a space for me, that would be arrogant to say. If I wanted to, I could. It's not the case. But it's a pretty amazing job to have. When I left ZB, it was never because, and I made this clear, it wasn't because I wasn't enjoying what I was doing. Loved what I was doing. Didn't even care about the hours, because I had my day worked out that I'd be in bed at 6:30 in the morning and up at 3 in the afternoon, and then I had the whole afternoon and evening off to myself. It worked for me. It was because I knew there was nowhere to go. There was nowhere to progress from an overnight host. And I said this bluntly to the bosses. I said, there's no progression outside, within this building, on this floor, there's no progression for an overnight host. And they were all like, whoa. And I just said to them, well, you just tell me one overnight host that's progressed from where they are to somewhere else on this floor. And they always talked about Marcus Lush. And I'm like, yeah, but Marcus went to FOVO FM. He moved to the other end of the country and did a whole bunch of other stuff, and then you brought him back. There's not a progression. And I didn't want to be a 45-year-old or a 40-year-old there, they're not enjoying it. So I got out before that happened, and And that's a good, you know, I mean, it takes a lot of honesty to realize when, and I hope when my time comes, like when I left Mai FM, that was my call. I was 40 the year that I left Mai, and I was like, I'm not going to be on air at 40. We started that conversation 2 years before.
Right.
I don't want to be the person 40 plus go, what's up? And pretending that I knew what the hell I was talking about when I'm 40. And I made the call to leave. And then at some point, hopefully when the conversation comes for me to leave the breeze, I'm a part of that conversation ultimately. And, you know, that's my intention, is that I make that call when it's time for me to go. You don't want to be the person where they take you into the room and say, it really is, your time's up. You know, hopefully I can proceed that.
That does happen though, doesn't it? I mean, I look around without trying to, it's not a criticism of people, but there are some approaching 50-year-olds who are working on radio stations who are kind of pitching to 19-year-olds. And I wonder how you can go, like you're saying, what's up? But or whatever the equivalent less than a 1990s reference might be for that word today. But I think about it. I heard someone the other day, and it doesn't matter who it was, but talking about they've just bought their mother an apartment, and I was like, gosh, if I was that person in that position, and you know I was a bit older and the audience was a bit younger, but I was used to having that kind of access to income, it would be very hard, very scary to then move away from that and see a transition like you've been so successful in doing, because there's only a certain number of jobs in this industry and it's getting smaller and smaller with things like networking.
For sure. I mean, I was lucky in some ways because I started on breakfast, and that was just by a fluke on Mai FM, because when the station began, they wanted me to do drive. I said, well, I can't do drive because my youngest, well, I only had a child, my one child at the time. My child's at daycare. I need to pick them up in the afternoon. And so Ross Goodwin, the boss, said, well, you can do the breakfast show. I was like, what time does that start? And he said 6. I'm like, okay. That's how I got breakfast. So I've only ever done the breakfast shows, and only on 2 radio stations, the Mai FM and the Breeze. So yeah, that's kind of that. People ask me for my story, how I got to breakfast. I was like, because my kid was in daycare.
That's a pretty cool story. That's like they asked me. I kind of got into the end of Maori FM just before the Bachelor of Communications became a prerequisite for radio, and so I'd have people coming on afterwards saying, "How did you get your first job?" I went, "Oh, I went to the boss at Maori FM and asked, how do you get into radio?" And 10 minutes later, he said, "Why don't you come on board with me and we'll train you up?" And that's it. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, right place, right time. Obviously needed someone, and he went, "You'll do," and that's it.
Yeah. Now you got broadcasting school and you got AUT, so there are all these, and the school in Tauranga as well. So there's all these opportunities for people to get a heads up on radio if that's what they want to do.
It was interesting. I remember you flipping from Mai across to the Breeze, and you were talking about Robert Scott before, and I think he might have been on Solid Gold before you. And I always thought, didn't know either of you. It was a really interesting mix. Someone kind of coming from a youth radio station and someone almost coming from a radio station which maybe was even a bit older together, and how that would work. Obviously it did. But yeah, how did you address that, kind of coming from this young, cool hip-hop station to what many, I mean, I like the Breeze, don't get me wrong, but many people would call kind of an adult, middle-of-the-road kind of AC contemporary station.
Yeah, well, there are two things there. One is going from a youth radio station to the Breeze, and, you know, normally you have a restraint of trade. You can't work for, you know, like 12 weeks or whatever it is. But Mai FM were really lovely. They said, okay, you want to go, when do you want to start, you know, on the Breeze? I said, well, I've got to go overseas for work for TV for a couple of weeks. I'd love to go straight to the Breeze after that. And they said, fine. So that doesn't happen normally in radio. So 2 weeks time, I went from this breakfast show where the phones were going nuts on Mai FM to the Breeze where no one knew who we were because we were just starting again. Like we're a startup. And it was like this, you know, tumbleweed went across the desk at work. So that was a huge learning curve for me, because like when you matter, everyone wants to know who you are. When you start all over again, no one gave a damn. But with Robert Scott and I, we were friends before that. We'd done a con ticket together a few years before that. So we were mates. So the relationship was easy. The relationship for us as two people to communicate together, we fast forwarded that bit. You know, with breakfast shows, they have to pretend like they're mates until they actually do get to know each other. We already knew each other. So that was the fast forward to that bit. So it actually made it a lot easier, I think, for the Breeze because we were already friends.
And I think those make the best teams. I think about the kind of heyday of New Zealand radio through the 90s, and that does feel sort of like a bit of a heyday. And you have guys like Kim and Corbett, really good mates off here. You have guys like Roger and Nick on the Rock, really good mates off here. You have Polly and Grant, married, obviously, mates off here. Even on the Edge, you have JJ and Dom, who are married. I think either married at the time or certainly good mates on the air. And it seems that those make the best tandems anyway. They make the best teams who have a genuine relationship that there's nothing put on, are always the ones that seem strongest to me.
Well, when you create a breakfast show, you just bring these personalities together because on paper it feels like they will get on. It takes time for them to get to know each other's rhythms. Like with Jeanette Thomas and I, we can be in the middle of a voice break and I know where she's going to go and she knows where I'm going to go without saying anything. Also, the most important thing is trust. You have to trust each other. I know that when we go on air, she'll never say anything to get a point on me, to embarrass me, and vice versa. And when you have that amount of trust, you have a friendship that is a foundation of all of that as well. So when these shows come together, they're trying to get that groove. It can take a little while. I've been lucky. I've gone to work with my mates, and that just makes life so much easier. When there's a problem, you can talk about it with each other. You don't need to call in the content director to have a mediated conversation about what that person said. And that happens.
Yeah.
Go, hey man, that sucked. And I've been called out at times. I've given myself a talking to. I went to work one day in a bad mood. I said, excuse me, I walked out. I gave myself a talking to. I came back and I said, I've been an asshole this morning, but I promise you I'll be better from the next voice break on. And you can have those conversations with your mates. Nice
maturity as well. That's if I was sitting opposite you that morning, thinking what a prick Robbie's been this morning, that would be such a brilliant way to kind of go, right, that's done, let's move on. That's great.
Yeah.
Hey, in the I don't know whether it was 80s or 90s, but certainly that era, you were doing a fair bit of TV as well. Sure. Is that? And funny, like I said, I was talking to Clint the other day, who's the one of the co-hosts on the Edge breakfast show, who's just started The Masked Singer. Is there still TV work and stuff around there that you're getting offered, want to do, are a part of, or is that in the rear vision mirror a little bit, and it's radio moving forward?
Not really, and that's okay. Like I think, there's this new generation of people coming through, and they should have those opportunities. And the last thing I did was Dancing with the Stars. As an experience, but I've done things like motorsport. I went to the Indy 500 4 times. I love motorsport, so for me to do that, that's hard to top. As a TV gig, that's right up there with things that I love doing. So I've done some amazing things. So I don't ever hanker after television per se. There've been times when I've said no to some things, and I think people go, he's not interested, he doesn't want to do it. If the right thing came along, maybe, but I don't sit around waiting for those things to drop. And I'm really lucky because I have a daytime gig anyway. And then the Wiggles came along, and like that pushes a button that I can't get anywhere else either, So in terms of my time, it's lovely to have those opportunities come along, as well. So no, it's not. I don't look in the rear vision mirror and go, golly, I wish I was on TV more.
But when I say that as well, it kind of feels like that is a thing of yesterday, and it's not something you're retaining moving forward. I mean, I'm assuming that you were saying if it was to pop up and it was to be the right opportunity, a la Wiggles, you address it at the time.
But the thing is, radio takes up, honestly, and if you do radio well, and this is not just me, everybody who has done well in radio, it takes up so much of your time.
I know. That's the that's that irony. The irony when I was in the car as a kid going, oh, she only works for 4 hours a day. I'm sure you had a chuckle with that because, for people who don't know, if you're doing a breakfast radio show, you're getting there at the latest 5 in the morning, and you're not leaving kind of before 11, 12 in the morning. And even if you do get to leave at 11, 12 in the morning, you're still working that afternoon on tomorrow morning's program. And yeah,
for sure. And you always it's constantly in your mind. You're always looking for stuff. And this isn't just me. This is, a lot of other people in radio. So for something to come along, I asked work for 2.5 weeks off to do the Wiggles tour, and bless them, they said yes. But also realized that I left my mate Jeanette Thomas and our producer Braden Priest to have to do the show. Well, I went off and dressed up like a fish and danced around on stage with Dorothy the dinosaur, Wags and Dog, and all the other Wiggles. But I needed to do that, and bless them, they knew that as well. I said, look, this is the thing I have to do. I want to get to the end of my life and go, I did a full-on tour with the Wiggles, and I had an absolute ball. And I was allowed to do that. So if I'm going to give up any time from the radio to do something, it has to be something pretty special, and the Wiggles was that for me.
I read an article on you a little while ago around turning 50, and you were facing your fears, and you got to do things like dive with sharks and that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
As the person you are today, a fully formed, functioning human being, do you still have any fears in your life? Things that you are worried about, concerned about, be they sort of more existential fears or physical ones as well?
You know what? I don't know. I think probably I think about those things more than I did when I was younger. I think as you get older and your children are growing up and your body is not, you get out of bed in the morning when your alarm goes off to go to work a little bit slower than you used to. Not that I'm at the end of my, of the track at all, but as your parents get older and you lose your mum, you start to look at, well, what legacy isn't the word, but hopefully you hope to leave this world a better place, at least for your family, absolutely, obviously for my wife. I hope that I have made a difference in their lives, and that people will look back on what I did for a job and they'll speak kindly of me. I think that's probably as deep as it goes in terms of, I don't have any existential fears as such, but I just want to be good, be a good person.
I think it's that Jim Jeffries philosophy. I'm pretty sure it was Jim Jeffries who was asked, what was his philosophy on life, and he said something like, have a good time and don't be a dick.
Yeah, man. Don't be a dick. It's actually really easy not to be a dick. But you'd be surprised how many people lose that, don't see that opportunity necessarily. So that's it for me, bro. I mean, we'll have grandchildren coming along, and
wow,
I'm excited about, being a granddad, being a koro to these young babies and these young children coming into our lives. And, my dad's still with us, so I love sitting down and spending time with him. We did the Transalpine from Christchurch to Greymouth over the summer break, because he's always wanted to do that, so for me to spend that time with him was just friggin' awesome. So it's finding those opportunities in my life where I can just add another thing to my kitty of stuff that I've done.
I was talking to Pete Bethune, the guy who ran the 80 Gill, and he's an environmentalist, super environmentalist. I talked to him just after he was bitten by that snake in Costa Rica a few months ago and nearly died and came out of it. And he had quite a perspective on life based on who he is and what he did, but also based on him basically thinking, am I going to die from this snake bite?
Yeah.
And I think when you talk, right, so you're talking and I'm thinking out loud and thinking about legacies. And he said one of the things he does is he gets asked to speak to, business forums and stuff. And he always says to them, what's your legacy? What are you leaving behind? And if anyone ever says, my kids are my greatest legacy, he just looks at them and says, it's not enough. That anyone can do that. Anyone can leave kids behind. It's not enough. It's not a good answer. You got to do more than that. And I was just like, holy shit, that's a real challenging sort of an idea that, your kid might cure cancer, but that's still not enough as a legacy to leave behind.
Look at what our kids are doing. I spoke at this youth thing recently. I was like, easily add up the age of all the kids in the room. It was close to my age, and their ideas and their what they want for the world and the actions they want to take. I was like, oh my! And I've always said this to my children as well. So the youngest, Nikki and I have a blended family, 16 to 28, and I have so much hope for the future because how they see the world around someone's sexuality, LGBT plus, around someone's gender, obviously around the use of te reo Māori, around te ao Māori, the Māori world, and how that is to be interplayed into a normalize it. It's a part of our lives. Is for them, it's a given. That's what it is. My generation, and I know this because I talked about it on air recently on The Breeze, and people were going, oh, what's with all this Maori stuff? I was like, yeah, you don't get it. You just don't get it. I'm not even bothered trying to explain it to you. You just don't get it, but our kids do, and your grandchild will get it, and that's where the future is. So I'm excited, man, for what that next generation are going to achieve.
Well, one of the exciting things I heard when I was listening to you, and I mean, it's more of a business kind of work thing, is, dude, you've launched, and I didn't put two and two together, but you've launched 2 radio stations doing the breakfast show that of their era and still today are the biggest radio stations in the breakfast slot in the country. That's a pretty amazing, if nothing else, that's a pretty amazing legacy to have to this point with still more to come. So, you know, that's kudos to you, obviously, and just speaks to who you are and how you operate to be able to add your talents to those formats and give them the success that they have. But
man, I add my talents to it. It's not, I've been lucky, man. I've worked with some incredible people and they've taught me a lot, you know, and so with Mai FM and The Breeze being as successful as they are, like, I'm really proud of what I did at Mai FM, but what Mai FM means to me is different to what it means to Nixon and Jordan and Tegan now. You know, they are taking that radio station to wherever they need to take it. But I'm proud of what I did for that time that I was there. And it's the same with The Breeze. But you get to work with some incredible people, you know, great things happen.
You're being lovely and humble, and that's good on you, love. But but if you hadn't have had the success you had with Mai FM when you were there, and with your talents added to the mix, then there wouldn't be a Mai FM for them to move on with. It's that idea that, you know, I have to acknowledge if I'm seeing further, it's because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, so you're the giant in that situation, and Nixon and those guys are standing on your shoulders. If you weren't there, there'd be no Mai FM to take forward. And I'm not trying to blow smoke up your ass, but I just want to be honest with you about the things that you have left before you within the work context that will echo through the, you know, decades to come.
Yeah, I don't know who's going to play me in the movie, but
hey, I was one other quick thing as well, because it's not a very well formed thought yet. So bear with me. I'm still kind of thinking about it. I love American politics and I love American media and I follow it a lot. And you constantly hear people talking about, you know, especially sort of older Americans, typically older white Americans, talking about they side with the founding fathers. The founding fathers of this, the founding fathers of that. And often they do it as a way to shut down conversation, often coming from young people. And the thing that I'm realizing, and the thing that I'm in the process of, I'm going to write a blog piece on it at some stage and do it, is that a good number of the founding fathers were in their 20s and 30s. And I think about these guys today, this older generation, maybe boomers, I am stereotyping a bit there, not wanting to relinquish, but actively saying, I'm going to hang on the words of these 20 or 30-year-olds from 1776. And I kind of go, what about the 20 or 30-year-olds of 2021? Why aren't we hanging on their words? And I do sometimes think a bit about ZB. This is another one of the reasons I sort of moved on, is I said to the bosses again, actively and very politely and, you know, respectfully, is that when people like Holmesy and when people like Leighton Smith and these guys came on board, they were in their 30s, right? And me as an arrogant 30-something-year-old then said, I'm in my 30s. That the progression should be the next range of people should be coming through now that can then host the next 20 years. But of course, what's happened is they start in their 30s, and then when they replace people, they're replacing people who are already in their 50s because it's supposedly what the talk model is. And I've just got this thing at the moment, as I said, it's not a fully formed idea, but kind of going, if we look back upon those times gone by, and we go, that 34-year-old Paul Holmes was the perfect person for this job, or that 21-year-old Alexander Hamilton was the perfect person to sign that document and to, you know, to start the currency system of America. Why do we look at 21-year-olds today and 35-year-olds today and go, you know nothing? When you get to 50 or 60, I'll start giving you some space to share your thoughts. Doesn't make sense.
Right. For sure. It's like the way they treat Greta Thunberg. You've got a person who is passionate about the specific thing about the environment and is calling attention to it constantly. And I have the same thing when people criticize me when I speak about Te Reo Māori and you know, I don't want people start a petition to have it taken off TV1 News. You know, there's too much Maori. They hark back to what they understand because their world is changing and they don't understand it. They just know that the world is changing and that people that normally don't have a voice suddenly have a voice, and they feel uncomfortable about that because those voices are now calling them on their behavior and the way that they've been treated. And you either go, I'm going to just stick my head in the sand and just quote 1776 in the Constitution, or I'm going to quote what it used to be like in New Zealand back in the day. Look, man, in the 60s when my parents were married, my mum was Pākehā, my dad's Māori. When they would go and try and rent a house together when they were newly married, When Dad rang up, that place was not available. When my mum rang up and used her surname McKean, it was available.
Wow.
That wasn't even 60 years ago. You know, the picture theatres were segregated in Pukekohe. So we still have a lot of work to do. And it's good that our kids are calling us on that, going, well, actually, we need to learn about the wars in New Zealand. We need to understand about systemic racism. And I'm going to march up and down Queen Street to Aotea Square to talk about the environment. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, tough. And I love that.
I like to bring a perspective to talking about 60 years ago. And I talked about this the other day. I think by the time I was 30, so 15-ish plus years ago, by the time I was 30, right, so that would have been 2003, 2004,
yeah,
I was, my day of my birth was closer to the end of World War II than it was to that 30th birthday party.
Oh.
So that shows, and like right now, as I am closer to 50 than 40, the day of my birth is closer to the end of the 1920s depression than it is to today. So it goes to show how close that era is. It's, within a double lifespan of me, I'm getting towards the end of World War One.
Right, and people are unwilling to realize that, I had someone say to me, like, well, is there really racism in New Zealand? And I said to them, have you ever been pulled over and asked if you own your car?
Yeah.
Because I have 3 times.
Wow.
Have you ever been followed around a store and then been told by somebody that table I was looking at is very expensive? They go, well, maybe they were just trying to give you a heads up. I go, what? About whether or not I own my car? Have you ever been pulled over? Because none of my parkour mates have ever been pulled over and asked to produce who has ownership papers for their car, in their car. But I've been asked that. So you got to think, well, maybe that cop profiled me. Look, that's not all cops. But when you have those experiences, you know that there's racism in this country. And it's good that people are speaking up about that. And if it makes you feel uncomfortable, too bad.
Hey, Robbie, it's been an absolute pleasure having a chat with you today. I'd like to ask you one interviewee type question, because I've got to get one interviewee type question in through these conversations, is what's next for Robbie Rakete? What's up next? What's going on for you, mate, in the next week, month, year? What's on the horizon, other than obviously dominating the world of breakfast radio?
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, you know what radio is like, man. It's a daily grind. You got to feed the monster every single day. So that kind of tends to take up, a lot of my energy. But in terms of work stuff, there's nothing really new. I would love to have gone and done the tour with the Wiggles in Australia. There was an opportunity to possibly do that, but I've got a day gig, so that wasn't a thing that I could do. But there are other things I might do with the Wiggles later on this year once the bubble is truly open. I think there was a fear that I was supposed to go over last weekend to do some filming with them, but there was a fear that if I got over there and they shut it down, I'm suddenly stuck in Sydney trying to do a radio show from there. So there's always stuff on with the Wiggles. But bro, it's just radio and whānau and
grandkids.
Yeah, bro, I'm a happy man.
Hey, Robbie, thanks so much for giving us some time today. It's been a pleasure. I love talking. I wonder if I should start up like an industry specialized podcast to run alongside this, because I do love talking radio, but it's been good to talk to you about everything we've talked about today. And thanks heaps for giving us some time.
Well, kia ora, I appreciate the time. Thank you for listening to this old man ramble on about his career.